Good afternoon, everybody. Sorry for the slight delay, but welcome to this webinar about incorporating ECVET into your Erasmus Plus Key Action 1 VET application for 2019. Before we start the webinar proper, just a few technical points. We'd like to make sure that you not only can see us, see the slides, but hear us as well. So hopefully you can see this and you can hear us as well. So using the toolbar on your screen, could you just click the little icon with a hand there to raise your hands so that we know you can see the slides and hear my dulcet tones. Okay, it seems that everyone can see the slides and hear me, so let's carry on. First of all, some introductions. My name is Phil Whitney, and together with my co-presenter Sian Holleran, we represent the Celtic fringe of the ECVET experts group. Both of us are based in Colleges Wales in Cardiff. I work as a consultant with Colleges Wales on the various European initiatives, but of course specifically today here as an ECVET expert. And Sian is the international coordinator for Colleges Wales, very experienced in putting in KA1 applications for both students and staff. So she'll be doing more of the practical side today. So hopefully between us, we'll persuade you by the end of the day that incorporating ECVET into your Erasmus Plus application is a good idea. Let's just remind ourselves about why we're here. First of all, to fairly briefly introduce the principles of ECVET, or probably in many cases to remind you of the principles of ECVET, and then and I'll take you through that, and then Sian will take over and do the more practical side of today's webinar to explain how ECVET can be incorporated into your KA1 VET application, to identify the key elements of ECVET that need to be described in your KA1 VET application. And finally, I'll come back and draw on resources and signpost you to the many sources you can use to support the application that you are going to be put in for 2019. Just a caveat, although the program guide for 2019 has already been published, so we know that ECVET is an integral part of Erasmus Plus this year.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
The final guide for applicants has not yet been published, and that will come out at the end of the year. So although we are confident in the information we're giving related to previous applications, there may be some slight changes for 2019. So we're working on 2018 program guides and applications, but as I say, there may be some slight differences. So this information is provided by us as a group of the ECVET experts. But I'm sure most of you by now will have already seen the 2019 guide and will know that the application form is out as well. So there should be no surprises. We'd just like to do a quick poll to find out how much the delegates here today, the attendees, know about Erasmus Plus. So I'm going to hand over to, sorry, and I should have introduced her when I was introducing the team. With us today is Daniela Dimitrova, who works for the National Agency of Chorus. So she's helping with the technical parts and is going to take you through Right. Let's just see. 50% of you have submitted an Erasmus Plus KA1 application, so we got half and half. And of those of you who have submitted an Erasmus Plus KA1 application, we asked, did you incorporate a Memorandum of Understanding, a learning agreement, or a Europass, or included Europass mobility certificate? So out of the 50% of you who have already submitted or have submitted an Erasmus Plus K1 application, a high proportion, 83%, use a Memorandum of Understanding. Well, the same figures all the way through. So obviously the same people are using the standard documents for ECVET and using a Europass mobility. So there's quite a lot of experience with a fair proportion of you. Okay. Right. And finally, we asked how much you know about ECVET right now. Before we introduce ECVET, we asked you, do you know a lot, a bit, or nothing? And 100% know a bit, nobody knows a lot, and nobody knows nothing. So good. We have a basic level of understanding of ECVET, and we're just going to remind you of those basic principles now. So let's go back to introducing ECVET and what it stands for. What is ECVET? We don't mind whether you call it ECVET or ECVET, it's all the same to us, but ECVET is the European credit system for vet. You can see this definition as well as I can, but let's just go through because it is important. It's a framework for the transfer, recognition, and accumulation of acquired and assessed learning outcomes with a view to achieving a qualification. And we'll visit some of those key terms just now. Just to remind you, you can see the ship sailing along the European coast with geographical mobility and lifelong learning as the two sails. In the UK, we have concentrated on using ECVET for geographical mobility only. But because the principles of ECVET are based on learning outcomes which are assessed and can then be transferred, and these learning outcomes can take place in any situation and then transferred later on, they are an integral part of lifelong learning, and the same principles apply for geographical mobility and for lifelong learning. And those of you who are involved in RPL will be using these principles as well. What ECVET definitely is not, it is not a qualification or rewarding body. You won't get a certificate from Europe saying that ECVET has been used, and throughout all of this process, the requirements of your awarding body or the host institution need to be followed. It is also not compulsory. It's not compulsory at European level, although I have to say that all of the 28 countries, plus others, have signed up to using ECVET. It's also not compulsory within your Erasmus Plus application. However, and we'll take you through this today, it is recommended not just by the European Commission in their program guide, it's recommended by Erasmus Plus, and clearly it's recommended by the team of ECVET experts. But also, and importantly, it's also seen as important by experienced users of Erasmus Plus. And later on, I'm going to signpost you to some of the resources. And in there, you'll find a number of case studies and ECVET stories, all from experienced applicants. And they use ECVET, not because they have to, but because they see a clear and real benefit to using it. Let's go back and revisit some of these key principles. There are two sets of principles at the heart of ECVET. Probably the most important is the use of learning outcomes. This is not strange to you. You use learning outcomes every day within your qualifications. Learning outcomes either as part of units or as whole units. And also importantly, not only is the use of learning outcomes basic, but there must be agreed assessment, validation and recognition procedures in place. And these are tasks and responsibilities that need to be agreed among the participating institutions before mobility starts. And these principles apply wherever. It doesn't matter where they take place and which learning system, as long as learning outcomes are identified and as long as they are assessed and validated and recognized, this can take place wherever it's achieved. Let's just look at some of the specific ECVET terminology. You all know what learning outcomes are, statement of what a learner knows, understands, and is able to do on completion of a learning process. The important point of learning outcomes when you do take part in an Erasmus Plus KA1 VET mobility project is that learning outcomes must be identified for all projects, not just those incorporating ECVET. And those learning outcomes must be captured in a learning agreement. So this is basic. Everybody has to do it. So what we're suggesting, and hopefully you'll take this on board by the end of the presentation, is that what we're suggesting is that you incorporate what you have to do anyway into an ECVET background. Also remember that learning outcomes are bilateral. Although many of you will have just unilateral mobilities, most of you will have some sort of partnership where your partner organizations will come from one or more countries. So learning outcomes approach not only enable you to identify what learning outcomes your learner can achieve on their mobility, but equally when learners come to you, you can identify what learner outcomes are not only possible, but are viable during their stay. And also remember, it's important to concentrate on the fact that learning outcomes need to be identified and achieved within sometimes a fairly short timescale, 2 to 3 weeks for many VET projects. However, with the increasing use of longer stays now, particularly within the Erasmus Pro program, where there's a minimum of 3 months, learning outcomes might take place in complete units or qualifications. So let's look at what units are. Well, you know what a unit is. It's a coherent set of these knowledge, skills, and competencies. In other words, learning outcomes. Unlikely that a complete unit can be achieved during a short 2 or 3 week stay, but as I say, possibly on longer Erasmus Pro stays, quite possible to do that. When we talk later on about our ECVET stories, there are a number of institutions who have put together units for mobility only. By bringing together a set of learning outcomes, they have established programs and qualifications which can be achieved not only by their learners, but by visiting learners as well. And there's some good evidence and good examples of this in the ECVET stories. ECVET points, you may come across this from your partners in Europe. It is not something that we use in the UK, so as far as you're concerned, you can forget it. However, visiting institutions may include that as a point, but it only concerns them and not you. And then finally, in terms of ECVET terminology, credit is not based on guided learning hours, but credit just suggests that learning outcomes which have been assessed can then be accumulated and recognized when you get back to your home institution. So any learning is credited. There clearly has to be a benefit. If ECVET is not compulsory, why use it? Well, there are benefits for both parties. There are benefits for the learners, who should be the most important element of a mobility program. What ECVET does, by using identified learning outcomes that relate to their existing program, it makes mobility programs more attractive to learners. They see a point to it. And that's one thing that comes up in the ECVET stories, is that both experienced organizers and those who've only maybe used ECVET once or twice, they always say it gives far more focus and structure to their programs, not just for them, but for their learners as well. Because learning which takes place overseas is formally recognized, it means that learners no longer have to repeat or catch up on missed units or elements. So again, it makes mobility far more attractive and a benefit to the learner. And then finally, by using the documents that are well quality assured and have been in existence for some time, it means that learners are able to present their newly acquired knowledge to their employers better, using such tools as Europass certificates, for example. Sorry. And there are benefits for you. Why should you do it? I've used this word structure and focus. It allows you to, by using the documents such as the Memorandum of Understanding, to clearly identify and design programs of learning which both you and your receiving organization understand. Because you're dealing in a partnership, it means that productive long-term partnerships can develop. And I'm sure those of you who've been involved in Erasmus Plus applications before know that you can learn from other European countries. And it certainly helps from improving the profile and participation and visibility of institutions who take part in mobility. I was talking to one organization only last week, and they did a survey and found that almost 25% of their applicants for 1 year applied to that institution because there was the chance of European mobility. So it's a positive for you as well. So let's move on to ECVET and KA1. Let's start with the big picture. You have a program of qualifications in the UK made up of a number of units, these blocks, and you send a learner over to the Netherlands. Clearly, they're not going to achieve, unless the time allows, the whole qualification. So they may achieve parts, those represent parts of units, but made up of learning outcomes. So we're not suggesting that during the short time they're going to achieve everything, but they can achieve, by identifying the learning outcomes, they can achieve quite a lot. One thing that I should have stressed earlier on is that you don't need to incorporate ECVET immediately into all applications unless you've been doing it for some time. There are a number of steps to recognizing mobility, and today we're only going to cover a couple of these. However, there will be plenty of other opportunities for you to learn more about the total ECVET story, which I will cover later on when we go to resources. So I'm now going to hand over to Sean, who's going to take you through the practical side of the application. Just bear with us for a couple of seconds.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name's Sian Holleran. I'm here with Phil today to take you through the rest of this webinar. Phil's provided you with the basic principles and benefits of using ECVET, and I'm going to offer some more practical advice maybe on how you can integrate ECVET into your Erasmus Key Action 1 ECVET applications. I've been applying for Key Action 1 vocational mobility project since 2014 and previously with Leonardo da Vinci. I apply for consortium applications on behalf of the further education colleges in Wales. We send probably about 300 to 400 vocational learners and or apprentices on 2 to 3 week work placements every year through the consortium project that we managed. As Phil mentioned earlier, the advice we're providing in relation to submitting an application is provided by us as ECVET experts, and the UK National Agency obviously has to remain impartial, so we are just providing advice based on the information that we have to date. As we speak, and as Phil mentioned, the 2019 Key Action 1 application has just been made available this week. In fact, we've had a quick chance to have a look at the online application, so slightly different to what it was in 2018 in terms of it being an online application. But we still see that there is a big emphasis on recognising the learning that takes place on an overseas mobility. And the question box that we've put on your slide has been taken from the application form for 2019, and we're going to have a look in a bit more detail later as to what that really means in the application. As a starting point, what we can refer you to is the 2019 programme guide for Erasmus+. Those of you who've seen the programme guide in the past will know that it's a fairly lengthy document, but please don't print it all off because you won't need the 300 odd pages. You will just need the sections that relate to vocational education and training applications. Amongst the tools that are referred to in the programme guide and relevant to us in vocational education and training are Europass and ECVET. And one of the things to emphasise in your application is that you are using your application really to support EU transparency tools to recognise skills and qualifications. That's really well worth keeping in mind when you're considering your application. Just to move us on a little bit, the UK National Agency will of course issue its own guidance for submitting a Key Action 1 application, and this is really useful to refer to when you're completing your application. It's something that I will always have open in front of me when I'm doing my applications. The guidance from the National Agency isn't yet available because the application form has really just been released, but this will be available towards the end of November, beginning of December 2018. The guidance will provide you with the award criteria that are used to evaluate applications and is, of course, advisable to make sure that your application does address these award criteria. Another useful document that's highlighted to you on the screen at the moment is the Guide for Experts on Quality Assessment. This is produced for Erasmus Plus evaluators and provides a useful insight into what evaluators are looking for in your applications. You can see on the screen that this will have a focus on the recognition of learning outcomes that are achieved while learners are on mobilities overseas. So it is really important. It can feel as if there's a little bit too much to read before you put your application in, but if you've got time now, it is well worth having a quick look at the Guide for Experts. So back to the programme guide for Erasmus Plus, and particularly focusing on Key Action 1 VET mobility. Page 7 of the programme guide, as you can see from your screen, clearly makes reference to recognition and validation of skills and qualifications and makes a mention of ECVET. Page 51 of the programme guide also makes reference to a learning agreement, which we're going to have a look at a little bit later in the webinar. But as we've seen from the poll earlier on, there are a number of you who have already used a learning agreement. But it is one of the key documents that must be used if your project is trying to integrate ECVET into its activities. And just at the bottom of that screen there, I have actually put a link to the 2019 programme guide, which is available currently online. Again, back to the programme guide, just to highlight some of the documents we're going to be looking at in this webinar. On page 277 and 278, there's reference to a Memorandum of Understanding. Again, a key document that must be in place if your project application says that you're going to be using ECVET. What the MOU does is it identifies the learning outcomes to be achieved during a mobility activity, ensures that the activities and tasks of the mobility allow those learning outcomes to be achieved, assesses whether the learning outcomes have been achieved, and finally, what the process is for validating and recognising that. If you say in your application form you're going to be using ECVET in your project, and as Phil highlighted, it isn't compulsory, your project attracts funding, you will be sent templates for an MOU and a learning agreement that you will need to use, and these will be sent to you as part of your grant agreement if you're successful in getting funding. And that slide that's up now is just confirming and highlighting that if you are saying you're going to use ECVET, then you must use these templates that are sent to you with your grant agreement. It is important maybe to make the point here that you don't need to have these documents in place when you put in your application, but you need in your application to explain how those will be put in place during your project. So let's have a look at a Memorandum of Understanding in a little bit more detail. As I've said, it doesn't need to be in place before your application is submitted, but you will be asked in the application form, normally under the section that refers to project management and quality, how you will be setting up an MOU. So it's worth understanding what it is and what the content of an MOU is. So to summarise, the MOU is an agreement between the sending organisation and the receiving organisation, and accepts that there is trust between the two organisations in relation to the quality of the mobility period. The MOU will outline the organisations involved, the targeted learning outcomes, and what processes are in place for assessment, validation, and recognition of learning outcomes. And we've just put up on the screen the first two ECVET. We don't have time to go through this in detail, and as I've said, it doesn't need to be in place when you submit your application, but it is well worth having a look at, so when you're doing your application you understand what the MOU is. So pages 1 and 2 really are just for you to put information in about the organisations who are involved in signing this MOU. And moving on to page 3 and page 4. Again, we don't have time to go into the detail, but page 3 gives you an opportunity to give details of other organisations who may be involved in the MOU. For example, in the projects that I manage for Colleges Wales, our vocational colleges in Wales are linked to vocational colleges in Europe, who will then have links to local employers. So the work placements may be taking place outside of the vocational college in Europe. So you may want to list work placement locations in this particular section of the MOU. Page 4 is where you can reference the qualification or the qualifications. You can list as many as you like, but remember you're not meant to be creating extra work for yourselves, but trying to link the mobility period abroad with an existing qualification in the UK, if at all possible. And this, it gives you an opportunity to list the qualification that your participants are undertaking in the UK, what level they're at, and whether you are including further documents such as Europass mobility in the annex of the MOU. There is space on the template MOU you'll be sent for a number of qualifications, and sometimes what we stress in Wales is that this could be the core qualification the learners are taking, but it could also maybe refer to something that we've got called the Welsh Back that gives some of our learners an opportunity to have skills assessed that are linked to more global citizenship type skills. So moving on with the MOU, page 5 and page 6, quite short information here, just gives you an opportunity to put down the period of validity really of the MOU and whether or not that MOU will be evaluated on completion of the mobility. Obviously, evaluation is a key component of an Erasmus Plus application, and please don't forget, if you are incorporating ECVET, then it may be an opportunity for you to evaluate how well that aspect of the project went too. And space for signatures at the end of the MOU. So moving on to the learning agreements, and again we're going to have a little look in a bit more detail at the learning agreements. Just to highlight that this will cover a specific mobility period and is individual to each of the participants taking part. You may well have a group of participants following the same qualification undertaking work placements abroad with a view of achieving the same learning outcomes. In this instance, the learning agreement can be the same for each of those participants, but it must be signed by individual participants. So if we have a look a bit more closely at the different pages of a learning agreement, pages 1 and 2 looks very similar to the MOU, but in addition to the sending and receiving organisation, there is also an opportunity to put in the details of the participant. So this is bringing the learner into the equation and making sure that they are also aware of what's going to be expected of them on the mobility abroad. If you are using an intermediary organisation to support you in finding work placements, then there is space to put their details in the learning agreement too. Moving on to pages 3 and 4, this is where you will register the duration of the mobility period and details of the qualification and where that participant is in relation to that qualification. So perhaps just listing a qualification doesn't really give an indication of what that applicant is capable of. So this is giving you a chance to flesh out that information a bit more. And here you'll also have a chance to tick any attachments that you might include in the annex, such as the Europass mobility. And we'll have a look at that Europass mobility a little bit later in the webinar. Pages 5 and 6, again drilling down a little bit more detail really into the details of the learning outcomes and setting dates, if possible, for the assessments to take place. I think probably, as Phil suggested just at the end of his part of the webinar, if you've never used ECVET before, then please don't think that all of this has to be in place overnight. There are just certain steps that you can take to start integrating ECVET into your projects. If it's the first time that you're working with a European partner, you may not be able to do all of this, but you could just focus perhaps on the MOU and getting that in place and evaluating it. Same with the learning agreements, but please don't beat yourselves up if you don't manage to achieve ECVET in its entirety in one project. That's quite difficult to do. So moving on slightly, in 2019, as we've said, there will be an online application for Erasmus Plus that has literally just been released. And what we've had a quick chance to do is to have a look at the application and to see where we can see signs of ECVET principles in that application form. In terms of learning outcomes, there is a question in the application form asking what kinds of learning outcomes are going to be identified for your learners on their mobilities overseas. These learning outcomes are normally related to units or modules from existing qualifications that participants are currently studying, but as Phil mentioned, it could also be a unit or a module that you pull together made up of different learning outcomes to be achieved on the overseas mobility. It can be a good idea to put a sample training plan into your application form, suggesting the types of learning outcomes that could be achieved for your learners and that have already been negotiated or discussed or at least talked about initially with your receiving organisation. So that is a suggestion, maybe at application stage, not the MOU and the learning agreement in place, but possibly a draft training plan. And there are definitely questions in the 29 application form asking about what type of recognition you're going to be giving to your learners for their period of mobility overseas. And again, in the application form, as we've mentioned already, we're not identifying the exact position of this in the application form, but there is a mention of explaining in detail how you're going to set up your Memorandum of Understanding and your learning agreements. And what I would say is be as clear as possible. Imagine that the evaluators know nothing about the setup of your organisation and how you can make this a simple explanation as to who will be involved and how that process will be managed. Part of recognising learning obviously is the monitoring of participants while they're overseas. In the case of the Colleges Wales project, all of our FE college participants are accompanied by staff who are there for the well-being and welfare of those learners. But you will need to work out how those participants are going to be monitored during the work placement. Who is going to monitor whether the tasks that they're doing are going to lead to those learning outcomes being achieved? It may be that it is the responsibility of the accompanying staff who are with them, or it may be that the receiving organisation has staff who are going to be involved in that. So if we move on to the Europass documents, some of you may be aware of Europass. Europass is made up of a suite of 5 different documents, a CV and a language passport, which any one of your participants can complete online themselves. The Europass Mobility is something that you as an organisation will need to register your participants for. So the Europass Mobility, once you've selected your participants and once you have details of where they're going to be doing their work placement or their training, you will need to register them on Europass. An electronic document is generated and shared with the receiving organisation, but you can also print off a hard copy that can be taken with you. And from evaluations that I do, a lot of our colleges like to take the hard copy with them. The learners or the participants can complete the relevant section, which is section 5A, while they are abroad, and it can all be tidied up and made into a presentable document, either abroad or when you come back to the UK. It is a record of the learning that's acquired on an overseas mobility. It can be used by participants for interviews, promotion opportunities, applications to university or to further study. And it is a concrete record signed by the receiving and the sending organisation that is a really useful document for the participants. At the bottom of that slide, you will see a link to where you can register your participants for the Europass Mobility document. There are a number of organisations that I work with who will use the Europass Mobility, and it's supplemented maybe by a reflective log that the learners will keep while they're on work placement. Some organisations, it is a way of good practice, will identify the learning outcomes at the top of every page of the reflective log, just to keep in the learners' minds as well that they are trying to achieve some learning objectives while they're abroad. So Phil introduced this visual a little bit earlier on in the webinar, looking at the big picture of learners from the UK travelling abroad, and some of those learning outcomes being identified and being recognised during the overseas mobility. So what we've now put in the middle of that visual is some of those ECVET principles and documents that will help put some structure to that mobility, really. So in the middle you'd have your MOU, your Memorandum of Understanding, so the agreement between the sending and the receiving organisation, the learning agreement that will bring in the participant into the equation, and how that learning is captured and brought back to the UK, either in a Europass Mobility or the Europass Mobility plus a reflective log, or other personal transcripts that you might put in place for your participants. And just to reiterate, these don't need to be in place before the mobility, before the application goes in, but you will need to explain in the application exactly how those are going to be set up. So before I hand back to Phil, this is just a quick reminder of the steps that need to be taken to integrate ECVET into your application. We've had a look at an MOU, we've had a look at a learning agreement, and we've touched on Europass mobilities as part of a personal transcript that can be used to record that learning. I think an important step right to the very beginning maybe is, if you're sitting there now thinking, oh my goodness, that's an awful lot of work, is to maybe reflect on what you currently do. And you may not call things an MOU, you might not call things an ECVET learning agreement, but you may have some of these things already in place, and they just need to be tweaked a little bit to make ECVET more explicit maybe in your application. So I'm now going to hand back to Phil to take you through the last part of the webinar. So thank you very much for listening.
Okay, thank you, Sian. Right, just to finish off the last part of our webinar today, I want to take you through some of the resources and support that are available, because we appreciate that in an hour webinar, particularly for those of you who haven't used any of the ECVET tools and documents so far, there's a lot to take in. But there's a wide range of information available at not just European national level, so there's no need to worry about not being able to find information. There are plenty of resources to help you with that. We've for some years run a series of targeted workshops across the UK. This year we ran 2. We haven't got dates yet for 2019, but there'll certainly be workshops which are longer full-day workshops which take you through all the steps of ECVET mobility that you've seen on the slides today. We also, of course, do webinars. We did a webinar last year on incorporating good practice into Erasmus Plus applications. And for those of you who are relatively new to ECVET and want a longer workshop on what ECVET is, there's another webinar on December the 7th, which of course you can sign up for, is being promoted at the moment, which takes you through all the steps we've described today. The main source of support for information about ECVET at the moment can be found through the Erasmus Plus pages, and you can see the link under further information and support. Your main source of information is from the How You Can Use ECVET page, and if you go on there, either by clicking on some of the colored pictured icons which describe the key components and the various stages of before, during and after mobility, and down the right hand side there are some key documents. The first key document describes the seed event, and apart from our targeted workshops and webinars which we run, we also do international conferences. Some of you may have been involved this year in the seed event, which took place in July 2018, and last year a larger event in Birmingham called the Pearl Conference, which talked about, which investigated incorporating ECVET into Erasmus Plus. Information on both those international conferences can be found through the Erasmus Plus pages. On that page of how you can use ECVET, There's a very useful document organisers of Erasmus Plus mobilities, but who also use ECVET and incorporate ECVET into their mobility projects. And I strongly suggest you look at them because they give some fantastic examples of how ECVET is used to, not just because they have to, because it's not compulsory, not because they have to, but because they find it gives this structure and focus I talked about before. And also, it's very useful in terms of finding out how they use what might appear to be some fairly standard documents, such as the MOU and the Learning Agreement, as true working documents, so that everybody, in terms of the Memorandum of Understanding, everybody's responsibilities from the sending and receiving organization are known and understood. And from the Learning Agreement, that learners can see how they'll be assessed and how they will be incorporated into their overall qualification when they come home. Shana's not just touched on it, but it's also, of course, useful to stress that it's an opportunity. Erasmus Plus Mobility is an opportunity to incorporate other qualifications into your mobility, not just the there's a link on the Erasmus Plus page so that one of the ECVET experts can speak to you. So if you want a conversation about any aspect of incorporating ECVET into your application, just you fill in that form and someone will get back to you. Finally, the last is a here's a link here to the ECVET Mobility Toolkit, and that has been in existence for a number of years and has been added to during that period. And it's extremely useful because it can be used by complete beginners to ECVET or those with some more experience. 3 sections: an introduction to ECVET, which shows more clips from various countries across Europe about how they use ECVET, and it includes, interestingly, one from Glasgow Kelvin College, one of the ECVET stories on the Erasmus Plus pages. Then there's an ECVET toolkit, which breaks down in order to get a vast amount of information about ECVET mobility. And then finally, just to reiterate, there are 4 ECVET coordination points across the UK, so there's someone near you. However, importantly, there are 11 of ECVET experts across the UK and Wales. So when you ring, call ECVET and want someone to come and speak to you, there will be someone local who'll be able to take your call and who you probably will know as well. So plenty of information, plenty of support available. So we now come to the end of our webinars, but before we leave, just like to ask you to take part in a final poll. Very similar questions. So I'll hand over to Daniela to take you through this. Right. First question: are you going to submit an Erasmus Plus KA1 application in 2019? 90% of you will be doing that. Right. Everyone's going to use the learning agreement, which is good. Everyone's going to use Europass mobility, and all of them, 90%, will be using a Memorandum of Understanding. So high figures there, and hopefully our webinar has helped you in your decision on that basis. And then finally, good. I'm glad no one's going back to nothing, but we've increased our percentage from nothing for a lot to 30% of you. So we're glad of that, and we're also glad that this relatively short presentation has helped with your knowledge and also decision to go ahead with using ECVET during your 2019 application. So I'll finish by thanking you very much for your attendance. If you have any questions, you can submit them online. Sean and I will be around for about half an hour before we go back across Offers Dyke. But in the next few days, you'll have a follow-up email from a caller just asking for information and some further feedback. Okay, so with that, I thank you very much and wish you a good rest of the day.